Wasn't surprised by the verdict, nor the 5-year jail term he received. This, after all, was the man who coined the phrase the party of crooks and thieves to describe Vladimir Putin's united Russia. Well, on being led away, Navalny's parting words to his supporters were, "Don't do nothing." And his supporters have vowed to continue the fight.
This wasn't a trial. It was a mockery of a trial. The judge looked like a judge, but he was a mummy dressed in a judge's costume. There wasn't a single argument made that proved that Navalny conducted anything other than usual business deals. There was no proof that Navalny stole 16 million rubles, about 400,000 euros worth of property. The evidence from the witnesses was falsified and fabricated. It's payback. Political payback.
Meanwhile, thousands of people have defied a warning from the Kremlin and have turned out to rally in support of Alexei Navalny. These are live pictures coming to us now from Moscow. There you can see people gathered in the streets. There are also protests taking place in St. Petersburg. So, punk band Pussy Riot, businessman Mikhail Khodorkovsky, lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, and now opposition leader Alexei Navalny all have one thing in common. They all crossed Vladimir Putin and they all ended up in jail. Here to discuss tonight, on my right, Nina ZAKHARINA-BEREZNER is a member of the Russian opposition group Russie, Libertés. Good to see you again, Nina. Also here with me is Douglas Herbert, France 24's international affairs editor, a fluent Russian speaker who spent many years in Moscow. He's also our resident Russia expert. In Moscow tonight, Alexei Malyshenko is from the Carnegie Centre's Society and Security Programme. In Bristol, over in the UK, John LAUGHLAND is Director of Studies at the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation. And last but not least, in New York, Rachel DENBER is a Deputy Director at Human Rights Watch. Well, good evening to you all. And remember, throughout this debate, we are looking to hear from you as well. Do join in and let us know your thoughts on the Navalny verdict. You can do that via Twitter and via Facebook. Well, let's get the debate started now. In this trial, there were 35 witnesses. 33 of them supported Navalny's version of events, while the defendant himself was not allowed to call a single witness. John LAUGHLAND, was this a fair trial?
I can't say I've followed the trial. What I can say, though, is that I've been now on France 24 4 or 5 times over the last 3 or 4 years, and every single time I come on, it's always to discuss the same issue. And that is because you concentrate almost exclusively on this issue of civil rights in Russia. You seem to be almost obsessed by it, in fact. It's really the only thing that you ever talk about. You talked about in December 2001 and 2012, early 2012, the demonstrations against the presidential and parliamentary elections, as if there had never been demonstrations in Russia before. You referred just now to Khodorkovsky as a oppositionist to Vladimir Putin, when everyone knows that people like Khodorkovsky and Boris Berezovsky were major gangsters, and nobody seriously doubts that they were complicit in very serious crime. As far as Navalny is concerned, I haven't followed the trial, but I know that the charges against him were well-founded. He was accused of embezzlement, which is a charge that is easily brought in Russia because a large section of the economy is indeed corrupt. And the idea that this trial was brought for political reasons is completely absurd, for the simple reason that Navalny does not have anything like the political support in Russia that you and other Western media claim. The Levada Center gave him 8% of the poll for the mayor of Moscow, which is the city with the largest electorate in support of liberals like him.
Is that the same Levada Center that says 44% of Russians believe this trial was politically motivated? You made a few points there.
Yes, it is that Levada Center. In other words, it's a center which is not suspect of any political bias. They gave him 8% for the Moscow City
John, one
elections.
Moment. John LAUGHLAND, thank you for making those points. I'm not going to respond to you. I'm going to allow my guest here, Nina, to respond to that. You're from Russia Liberty. What do you say to that?
Well, I think so far no expertise was shown at the trial. The witnesses weren't allowed to talk for Navalny, so I think it's obviously a politically motivated trial now that Navalny announced that he would like to run for president in 2018. I think it's obvious that Putin got very scared and decided, as he did with Khodorkovsky indeed, and with Magnitsky and Pussy Riot, when Putin gets scared, he just puts people to jail. I think it's very clear.
Douglas.
I was just going to make the point here, I guess, to John. I'll speak directly to him. a spokesperson for Russia's investigative committee. This is the Russian equivalent, John, as you know probably better than I, of the FBI. He himself said in comments last month, you may have seen them, he admitted that this was essentially a political trial. He didn't liken it to, a Stalin-era show trial. He said, listen, we have a guy here who had tried to draw much too much attention to himself, tried to be all flashy about it. And, he has to expect, he's going to come under scrutiny. They didn't even try to hide it, John, that this was a politically motivated trial. The guy who was running the investigation said it himself.
On to that.
We're having a little trouble hearing John Laughland there.
I'd like to respond to that.
Yes,
Is that
please,
okay?
go ahead, please.
I think if you're going to accuse this of being a political trial, firstly you have
not
to
me,
respond
not me,
to the
John,
fact that
not me, John. The head of the investigative committee of Russia, the Russian FBI, the man who conducted the Navalny investigation. It's not me.
If I could be allowed to speak without being interrupted,
Well, I
would like to say that if you're...
Please go ahead, John Laughland. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My point is that Navalny does not have any political support. He was given 8% in the opinion polls for the Moscow city elections. That means he does not represent a threat. Secondly, if you say it's a political trial, then you need to explain why of the 3 defendants, one of them pleaded guilty, and the other one, who was also convicted alongside Navalny, was himself a supporter of Vladimir Putin. This idea that Vladimir Putin is afraid of people like Navalny, or that he can simply ring up the judge and tell him to convict people, I'm afraid is a product of your fantasy. It does not correspond to reality in Russia today.
But then, John, could I just very quickly ask you something? I'm sorry. Why is it that Navalny has not appeared on Russian state television? You're absolutely correct, by the way, that we in the media talk a lot about him, and yet many Russians don't know who he is. But that's because he has almost no airing on Russian national state-controlled television. The only place he's really been seen, as you know, is maybe RAIN TV, which is an independent, young, online television station. The Russians don't see him. That's why they don't know about him.
I have an answer for that. He refuses to give interviews to Russian state television. He was doorstepped by RT last year, and they wanted to know why he would never give them an interview, and he refused to reply. He was extremely rude to them. As far as RAIN TV is concerned, it's a widely viewed satellite channel which all Russians have access to. So please let's stop this fantasy about, state-controlled media, civil society on one side and an authoritarian state on the other.
Is there something suspect about the timing of this? Alexei Navalny did just last week file his papers to run in that campaign to become the mayor of Moscow.
I am prepared to have a debate about these kinds of issues in a general sense, but I would like them to be put into a context. When Silvio Berlusconi was convicted of underage prostitution, just at the moment when he was contemplating a return to power, when Nicolas Sarkozy found his accounts invalidated by the Constitutional Court in France, just at the moment when he was contemplating a return to power, I think that we can have a discussion about political justice. When Navalny is prevented from running from the mayor of Moscow, when opinion polls give him only 8%, I think you have to be a fantasist to say that the judicial system needs to be employed to prevent him. He is a nobody going nowhere.
So would it not have been better, perhaps, to let him run in the race to try and become the mayor of Moscow and see what happened afterwards if he has so little support?
His campaign manager said that he had already taken the decision to withdraw. And frankly, I think that is his strategy. I think that is the strategy of him as of the people who he led out into the demonstrations. The problem is that last year and early in 2000 and late 2011, the problem is that the liberal opposition hoped that United Russia would fall below 50% in the parliamentary elections. And although, of course, they were returned with a greatly reduced score, they still managed to hold on to an absolute majority. And that drove the liberal opposition wild with anger and frustration. And their strategy ever since then, and Navalny is part of this, has been to discredit the entire Russian political system and to present it as irredeemably corrupt. And that's the vision which Western media, including France 24, happily go along with. But I'm afraid it's a political game. It doesn't reflect the reality on the ground.
John Laughland, you are on France 24 and we're hearing your views, so I don't think you can accuse us of being one-sided. I'd like to bring in another guest now. Rachel DENBER is with Human Rights Watch over in New York. Rachel, your reaction to what you've been hearing. Was this a political trial or not?
I think it's very difficult to see it as anything through any lens other than the political lens. both because of who Navalny is and what he's done and the timing of the trial, and also if you look at how the trial, just sort of the basic contours of how the trial has been conducted. John, you've been focusing on whether or not Navalny, the level of Navalny's popularity and how well he's known as a politician. I think that maybe it's a little bit beside the point. That how much of a following, what percent of the population would support him in elections. The point is that he is, whether you agree with him or not, he has a very big following. He represents a kind of an opposition leader of a very different sort. Because he's online and because he's attacking issues like corruption. I mean, corruption is his main issue, and it's an issue that resonates very, very broadly with the Russian public. And even if he's not presidential material, even if Putin is not afraid of him as a challenge to his, as a real challenge to his presidency, he represents. I think he does. He represents someone who has stepped beyond the limits of what I think the Kremlin is willing to tolerate. He had already been, the charges against him had been dropped twice. I mean, the investigation into this this allegation of embezzlement had already been dropped twice, and then 2 months after Putin was inaugurated, the investigation gets opened again. So I think that the timing looks a bit, contributes to a conclusion that there's a very, very strong political factor here.
Okay, Rachel, a lot of points made there. John Laughland, if I could bring you back in, I want to get your reaction to that, but also just a couple of other points about Navalny being seen as a threat to Putin. I mean, this is the man who did manage to whip up the biggest anti-government protests since Putin came to power in 2000. That, of course, back in 2011. I mean, do you seriously think that Putin doesn't consider this man to be a threat at all?
Effectively, yes. I mean, those demonstrations, I agree, were big. On the other hand, you gave them, and other media outlets gave them, far more importance than they deserved. People continued to talk about them for months after they had happened. The same attention was not given, for example, to the much bigger demonstrations that took place in Paris against gay marriage, which mobilized millions of people over a period of many months. The figures, yes, they were interesting. They showed, as I say, that there was a frustration with a section of the electorate, particularly the emancipated urban electorate in Moscow, with what is, I have no problem at all with someone saying that the United Russia and so on is an established political force with no doubt a lot of defects. So yes, of course, there's discontent, but I'm afraid it doesn't translate into votes. And that's what the liberal opposition, that is the liberal opposition's dilemma. And that's what political analysts...
Okay, but if this
That's what political analysts have to get their heads around. There's no point.
Right, but if this liberal urban group is just a minority, as you say, why not let them have a voice in Russian politics? If Vladimir Putin enjoys such widespread support throughout the country anyway, why can't he tolerate a little bit of opposition?
That's a ridiculous question. They do have a voice. They can be candidates. Navalny has never presented himself as a candidate. He didn't present himself in the parliamentary elections. He didn't present himself at the presidential election. Why not? Because he knows that he won't get any votes. The main opposition in Russia to United Russia comes from the Communist Party. And if you're going to discuss the opposition in Russia, then you should start talking about the Communist Party, because that systematically, for the last 20 years, has been the largest and most systematic opposition force to the United Russia movement.
Doug.
John, you're right. He didn't run parliamentary, but I mean, we all know he was very clear. He was a candidate. He registered this week on Wednesday for the mayoral elections. He's now apparently pulled out of that, and his campaign is now instead mounting a strategy to promote a boycott of the mayoral election, since they basically see it as illegitimate. And he's made no secret, as you and I know, of his ambition ultimately at some point, when and if he can, to run for president. So he does have major political ambitions. I just want to make one point, though. This trial, and I think I could say this factually, it doesn't come in a vacuum. It comes in a context. You mentioned the civil rights issue at the top of the show. This comes in a context where Putin, and yes, Putin and his regime have been cracking down and placing under very tight scrutiny all of the non-governmental organizations in Russia that receive any funding from the United States. They're seen as suspect. Almost talk, not quite there, of the U.S. as being almost a fifth column that is trying to bring down his government. That's pretty sinister talk. And if you're a civil rights group right now trying to do any political work in Russia, you're going to have an extremely hard time. Go ask Golis, the vote monitoring watchdog. They're practically being closed down. They're having trouble keeping their operations up, and they're just one of dozens right now. It's not a good climate in Russia. That's not me editorializing. That's a fact.
Well, I'm very happy to respond to that. The law on foreign agents and on foreign funding for non-governmental organizations, as I expect you well know because you sound to me like you're an American citizen, is drawn from the Foreign Agents Act of the United States of America, which is a very old law which was originally passed in 1938, which is still on the statute books, and which also, like the Russian law, uses the term foreign agents. And all it requires is that NGOs that receive foreign funding declare the fact. The idea that this is some kind of crackdown is absurd. There's absolutely no limit on such NGOs receiving foreign funding. They can have as much foreign funding as they like, and they can pursue all the political activities they like. All they have to do is to declare the fact. And the reason why they're asked to declare it, or made to declare it, is that there is a long history. You talked about context just now. There's a long history of American-backed and Western-backed, EU-backed political organizations masquerading as NGOs who are in fact involved in political activity. And since we're talking about Alexei Navalny, he is the recipient of aid of this kind. His Democratic Alternative Party that he founded some years ago was funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which, as you know, is a Congress-founded, United States-funded organization.
John,
so this is a classic example of how the United States or other Western powers
John,
do intervene financially.
Just let me bring in Nina Zakharina-Berezner.
I just wanted to make two quick points. First of all, he didn't run for president because he was actually sentenced to 15 days in jail after one of the protests. And then if you say nobody supports him, then how come there's thousands of people in Russia now in the streets for an unauthorized protest? And we know what happens with people if they go to authorized protests. They get arrested. They just get picked out of the crowd, and that's it. And they're in jail.
Yeah, let's remind our viewers, and John knows this. You saw these images. May 2012, 5 months after the big late December protests of 2011, those massive street protests, we had a slight sort of resumption of protests. They came back to the streets, and a lot of the opposition leaders were rounded up then. And that's why they're in retreat. That's why we're talking today about an opposition that's subdued, this malaise around the Russian opposition. There's a little bit of fear factor at work here. You say what you will, but
Douglas,
they see the consequences.
We're going to have to take a short break. Hold that thought. We'll get John Laughlin's response to that, I'm sure, right after the break. Stay with us. This is François Picard.